Now, beloved listeners, I need your help. What's a good collective noun for a group of scientific geniuses? A gaggle, a cluster, maybe even a big bang. Not that any of those would do justice to the extraordinary meeting of minds that came together at the first Solvay conference in physics held in Brussels in 1911. Marie Curie was there, so was Einstein, and the father of quantum theory, Max Planck. In fact, a veritable who's who of future Nobel Prize winners gathered together. But what actually happened when the most influential thinkers in physics and chemistry met up in person? It's what a fascinating new book called The Soul of Genius sets out to explore. The book's a triple biography that delves deep into the lives of Curie, Einstein and Solvay, the man who launched the groundbreaking science conferences named after him. The book's written by Geoffrey Orens, a former chemical engineer and a business executive at Solvay Chemical. On the blower now from his home in New Jersey. Geoffrey, welcome to our little wireless program.
Philip, it's great to be with you.
I've long been fascinated by a photograph, the one that inspired you to start looking into the history of the Solvay conferences, but I never realised its significance. It's called, as you point out, the most intelligent picture ever taken. Please explain.
Sure. This is a picture of the 1927 Solvay Conference on Physics, the fifth in a series that's actually ongoing to this day. It's called the most intelligent picture ever taken because of the 29 people in that picture, 17 of them had won or would win a Nobel Prize in physics or chemistry. So almost 60% of the people in this photograph were Nobel Prize laureates or soon to be. And you can imagine the elite level of brain power that had been assembled at that conference. And in fact, that picture inspired me to delve deeper into the Solvay conferences to understand their background, why they first started. And it really led me to the 1911 first Solvay conference on physics held in Brussels, sponsored by, as you mentioned, Ernest Solvay, a spectacularly wealthy individual who had made his mark in the chemical business and wanted to support scientific philanthropy.
Now, we know almost too much about Nobel, but I must say I warm to Solvay. A bit more of a biography.
Solvay was an interesting individual. He had not attended university. He always longed to be a physicist or a chemist of university rank, but he never attained that because he had a bout with pleurisy and couldn't attend university. Instead, he worked in his family's gas works in the Brussels area, and through hard work and innate intelligence that he had, he developed a process to make what was called soda ash or sodium carbonate. And the process that had been in place to make this material, which was used, the material was used in a host of applications as a processing aid or an adjuvant in the chemical industry. The process that was being used to make this was high cost and polluting. He had come up with a process over the course of a number of years in the 1860s that would be lower cost to manufacture this material, less polluting, and worked, frankly, better than the existing process, which was called the Leblanc process.
And of course it was used in glass making, soap manufacture, textiles, paper, etc.
Yes, and the uses were continuing to grow as industrialization took place around the world. He actually was what I would call the father of chemical engineering. He wasn't a chemist, he wasn't an engineer, but he worked on the equipment to utilize it to its utmost to manufacture materials in a way that could be low cost and very efficient. And that really was the precursor of what the chemical engineering profession was all about.
Now,
He
we
made
should pay credit to his friend Walther Nernst.
Yes, Walter Nernst was an interesting individual in the scientific world at the turn of the 19th century into the 20th. He was working on thermodynamics, but also in low temperature environments. He was coming across some very interesting scientific situations that led him to believe in Max Planck and Albert Einstein's quantum theory related to quantum mechanics, if you will. And in doing so, he felt that it was important to bring the elite scientists of Europe together to understand this theory in greater detail. The theory being that light as an energy source could exist not only as a wave, which was the classical view of how light energy worked, but both Max Planck and Albert Einstein felt that and could prove, at least theoretically, that light could exist as discrete packets of energy called quanta. And as Walter Nernst was doing experimentation in low temperature thermodynamics area, he was also coming up with conclusions that were similar to this. And he wanted Solvay to sponsor a conference to bring the elite European physicists and scientists together to debate this concept.
You point out, Geoffrey, that there had been scientific conferences pre-Solvay, but they were almost too big to succeed.
Absolutely. In fact, the major physics conference that brought international thinkers, physicists together was almost 900 people in size. The Solvay conference of 1911 was 24 individuals, including Ernest Solvay. So you can see in a smaller conference setting, what happens is you have time not only to present formal papers, you have time to discuss them, to debate them, and to even decide next steps to take for further exploration, which you couldn't do in these large conference settings that were starting to happen internationally at the beginning of the 1900s.
The king is dead, long live the king, at the first Solvay conference in 1911, effectively buries the genius or the immensely powerful theories of Isaac Newton.
Well, the situation was one where many people had not spent time understanding the power that Einstein and Max Planck had unleashed with their thoughts about the new way to look at energy in the form of light. And although classical physics was something that was so strong over the previous 250 years in terms of explaining visible large body phenomenon like stars and planets and how they interacted, gravity, laws of motion, those types of things. Quantum theory was really looking at a whole nother realm, looking at the subatomic universe, not the visible universe. And so the idea of understanding how the subatomic universe worked and things that were significantly different in their workings was a whole new realm that was opened up and exposed in that first Solvay conference to some individuals at the conference. They had never really spent any time thinking about it. And this was why the meeting was one that really changed the course of science. For the next 20 years, quantum theory was hotly debated by the elite level of intelligence in the scientific world.
Talking to Geoffrey Oren, so from telescope to microscope, we must also factor in X-rays.
X-rays at the end of the 1800s were discovered by Wilhelm Röntgen, and X-rays were something that really changed medical understandings of the body by being able to take a look at bones as separated from flesh and understand the difference there in a picture form. So X-rays were a certain form of electromagnetic radiation that Röntgen had discovered. And beyond X-rays, there was a woman who was starting to take a look at what she could do for her doctoral dissertation, and that woman was Marie Curie. And she had come across some work that a distinguished French physicist named Henri Becquerel had done on uranium rays. These rays from uranium were weaker than X-rays, but they were significant in their own right. He didn't follow up on that investigation, but she did. She did her doctoral dissertation on it, and with her husband, Pierre, in the process, they discovered radioactivity as such, even though Becquerel's rays, as they were called, from uranium had been known. She really put a name to radioactivity, discovered two elements in the process, radium and polonium, and went on to win 2 Nobel Prizes for her efforts, one in 1903 and the other in 1911.
And, of course, sadly to die as a consequence. Now, the first Solvay conference was like Einstein's debutante ball, you say very vividly, because he was a comparative unknown before then.
He was, and what was interesting about Einstein's situation was he had written 4 very powerful papers in 1905 that were published related to his quantum theory, related to his special theory of relativity, related to Brownian motion. These types of things were published, but in that time, they were published in a German physics journal. If you weren't reading German and weren't up to date on German physics journals, you might not have even heard of these earth-shattering papers. It wasn't until 1911, 6 years after these papers were published, that the French contingent got an up-close and personal view by being at the Solvay conference to understand Einstein's thinking about the subatomic universe.
And of course, everyone marvels at his brilliance.
Well, they saw that his mind was working at a level that many envied, if not saw was brilliant. They could see that he thought in a manner, thought experiments, they were called. He had a theoretical view in his mind of how the world worked. And to expose that to the rest of the European brilliance that was there at the Solvay conference really was a coming out party, if you will, for the brilliance of Albert Einstein.
So Solvay conference accelerates his trajectory. He goes from being an associate prof in Prague to Zurich and to Berlin. And at every step along, he gains positions that recognize him. And voila, the general theory of relativity.
Here it comes out in 1915. He's been working hard on this for probably a decade. The problem with the general theory of relativity, to those of us who aren't considered geniuses, is the difficulty in understanding a fourth dimension in third world dimensional terms, because that's really what Einstein was predicting with his general theory of relativity, as evidenced by the example that starlight could be bent basically by large bodies out in space, the sun bending starlight around it, which could be proven by taking a picture at just the right time and just the right location on Earth of the sun during a solar eclipse, when on the very edge of the eclipse, starlight could be seen to be coming position that was calculated as different from where it would be coming from if it wasn't being bent by the sun. So the idea of general relativity was something that was a fourth dimension of space-time. And it was something that really most of us couldn't understand. In fact, Einstein said himself there were only a handful of people in the world who could understand it at the time.
I am talking to Jeffrey Orens in New Jersey about his new book, The Soul of Genius. And rest assured, Jeffrey, that everyone that's listening to you has a PhD in an appropriate area. Now, Curie was at the time the only woman. Well, she was the only woman at the early Solvay conferences. We know how difficult it was for a woman in that era to get a career in science.
It was almost unbelievable that she could attain the stature that she did. The misogynistic view at that time culturally of women in a career like science was almost insurmountable. In fact, one of the best ways for her to surmount some of this prejudice against women in science was to be connected with her wonderful husband, Pierre, who, by the way, when the 1903 Nobel Prize in Physics for the discovery of radioactivity was to be given, originally Pierre was told, along with Henri Becquerel, that those two would be the ones who would be recognized for this. Marie Curie's name wasn't even mentioned. Pierre said, "I'm not going to accept the prize if my wife is not given full recognition as a person intimately involved in this discovery." Things changed in terms of the award, and Marie Curie was given her share of that prize. But she fought the misogynistic situation that was the standard in France and in Europe in the early 1900s. And to boot, there's also a very xenophobic element to her situation. A Polish woman in France trying to be recognized for all the work that she had done. There were a number of nativists in France who said, this isn't something we want to do.
Well, we'll look at aspects of that story, particularly unpleasant ones, shortly. But the first Solvay conference in 1911 puts Marie on the map in the same way it did Albert.
Well, if you take a look at her winning 2 Nobel Prizes, she had won one in 1903 with her husband. She won her second in 1911 in the realm of chemistry for her discoveries of radium and polonium and isolation of radium. She was the only woman to have won a Nobel Prize. She did it twice. She was the only person to have won a Nobel Prize in 2 distinct scientific fields, physics and chemistry. And she was basically at the height of her fame in 1911. So,
and then a tragedy will occur because, of course, her beloved husband is killed in an accident.
Her husband was killed in a tragic horse cart accident where he was run over and his skull was smashed. He died instantaneously. This was in 1906, and she was distraught. And for a number of years, she didn't know how she could go on. She had 2 young daughters. She lived for them and her research. But then she found love again in the arms of a French scientist named Paul Langevin. And Paul Langevin had been the protege of Pierre Curie. He was also a married man. And in 1911, at the Solvay conference, just as they were getting ready to leave the conference, the French newspapers had an explosive newspaper headline that swept through Europe. Madame Curie and Paul Langevin, a love affair. And so here was Marie Curie being exposed as what the French press called a homewrecker.
We should point out that his wife had discovered some love letters and published them in a newspaper to try and shame them into ending the affair.
She did, And Marie Curie, in her defense, said two things. One, that the married man, Paul Langevin, is not being dragged through the mud for this. The woman is being dragged through the mud. I am. As a woman, I'm being unfairly treated here. But beyond that, what she said was, you need to separate my work as a scientist from my personal life. My personal life is my own, just as it should be anyone's. And what you need to consider as a scientist is what I've contributed to science. And
Well, those words were blown away in the wind, and as you point out, Jeffrey, the letters were devastating. This was tabloid stuff, and in 21st century terms, and of course the letters were quite spectacular.
They were. They spoke of her being manipulative in trying to move Paul Langevin away from his wife and family, even though Paul Langevin admitted freely to anyone who would ask that he was unhappily married and had been in a verbally, if not physically abusive relationship. He had been hit on the head with a bottle by his wife, as in one instance. Another, he had garden chairs thrown at him by his wife. These were two very volatile people, Paul Langevin and his wife, and they really were codependent in their relationship, and they should have ended it, but they never did. Paul Langevin went back with his wife after this exposure of the tabloid fodder.
There was recently a not particularly successful attempt to tell Curie's story on a Netflix movie, but I do have an image of women almost demanding that she be burnt at the stake. She became absolutely noisily vilified.
It was a situation that was almost untenable in France. The French public very vocally crucified her. She actually went away in 1912 to England for the summer, stayed with a friend, brought her two daughters to try to get away from the incessant hounding of the press. She at the end of 1911, after the Solvay conference, within a month, she had a physical breakdown, a serious kidney problem, which resulted in an eventual operation. And mentally, she was completely exhausted, worn down by this constant press vilification.
But she found a friend in Einstein, didn't she?
Einstein saw her for what she was, which was a genius unparalleled in early 1900 scientific society. He knew that she was above all of this, and in fact, within a month of her being exposed in the press and the constant grinding of the French tabloid headlines, he wrote her a letter basically saying, Madame Curie, you're better than this. Don't listen to these headlines. They're hogwash. He said, leave them to the reptile that they've been designed to appeal to. And, basically wanted her to understand there was someone who understood her.
It's great, isn't it, that Curie had such a mind that Einstein could say, as they were walking along a mountain trail, I'm thinking about this complicated type of thought experiment. And Marie could not only understand it, but because of her own brilliance, could offer up thoughts herself.
She was someone who was brilliant in mathematics as well as the sciences. She could understand what Einstein was thinking about, and she didn't add to his theories as much as be a sounding board for him as his mind overflowed with ideas related to the subatomic universe and how to explain its machinations. So she was an individual who really could, on a one-on-one basis, connect with him as few people in the world could.
I'm suddenly thinking ahead to World War II when Einstein was so tormented about the possibility and the dangers of nuclear weapons. But let's go back to Einstein and Curie, because they serve on a committee together after World War One, and that is to further the course of science.
The idea at the time was Europe had been so completely fractured by World War One. How were they going to piece Europe together, not only politically and nation by nation, but how on a world scale were they going to get intellectual cooperation across borders? And so the committee was really one that focused on intellectual cooperation. It focused on how to bridge national borders and share again scientific understanding. And they were two people who basically worked towards this end because they knew that it was important to try to bind the wounds that were so badly left after World War One, and to do it on an intellectual basis: science, literature, music, the arts. And this was an important task. And actually, Marie Curie led in most of that. Einstein followed, but he got most of the headlines because he was the better known of the two, if you will.
Her legacy was quite extraordinary, wasn't it? And we should mention that her daughter, Irene, won a Nobel Prize in 1935 with her husband for studies on artificial radioactivity.
So here's her daughter following in her footsteps. Turns out her other daughter was also brilliant in her own right. She was brilliant in the arts rather than the sciences. She was a well-accomplished piano player, and she went on tours in France and Belgium. She was a journalist. She actually wrote the biography of her mother, Madame Curie. It was entitled, very formal, but still, when you read it, you felt the love pouring out from her. This was Eve Curie. And it turns out that not only Irene won a Nobel Prize, but Eve was married to a gentleman in the 1950s who headed up the UNICEF group that won a Nobel Peace Prize for the work they did with children. And so Eve Curie was part of that, and part of the Nobel Prize legacy, if you will. And an interesting fact, Curie's granddaughter, Irene's daughter, Elaine, married the grandson of Paul Langevin. So
How about that? Jeffrey, we've got to wind it up, but what a dynasty and what a story, and thank you for telling it so brilliantly. Jeffrey Ahrens is a former chemical engineer and business exec at Solvay Chemical. His new book, which we wholeheartedly recommend, published by Pegasus, is The Soul of Genius. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Thank you.